The television studio was buzzing with the usual pre-show energy when Ronaldo arrived for what was supposed to be a routine interview about his upcoming charity match. But the atmosphere changed dramatically when he realized that the host planned to spend significant time discussing his recent statements about Gaza. And when the cameras began rolling and the first questions focused not on his charitable work, but on whether he regretted speaking out about Palestinian civilian casualties, Ronaldo understood that this interview had been designed as an ambush intended to force him to walk back his previous comments or to create controversy that would generate ratings regardless of the human cost of treating ongoing tragedy as entertainment for audiences who preferred their international news to be filtered through celebrity opinions rather than factual reporting about what was actually happening to real people in real time. The host was a veteran broadcaster whose career had been built on provocative interviews that generated headlines and social media engagement, and his approach to the Gaza topic revealed his intention to create conflict rather than illuminate understanding, as he began with loaded questions that assumed Ronaldo's support for Palestinian rights was somehow controversial or inappropriate for someone whose job was playing football. And when Ronaldo attempted to explain that speaking about children being killed was not political but humanitarian, the host interrupted him repeatedly to suggest that he was taking sides in a complex conflict that he didn't fully understand, and that his celebrity status didn't qualify him to comment on geopolitical issues that required expertise he obviously lacked. The first sign that this would not be a typical celebrity interview came when the host displayed a graphic showing casualty figures from the conflict, but presented them in ways that seemed designed to minimize Palestinian deaths while emphasizing Israeli casualties. And when Ronaldo pointed out that the numbers appeared to be manipulated to obscure the disproportionate impact on Palestinian civilians, especially children, the host accused him of spreading propaganda and suggested that his emotional response to images of dead children was clouding his judgment about the complex realities of warfare that sometimes required difficult choices that people outside the conflict couldn't fully appreciate or evaluate fairly. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything viewers had seen in mainstream television, as Ronaldo refused to be intimidated or redirected from his central point that killing children was wrong, regardless of the political context that surrounded such killings. And when the host attempted to shift the conversation to Israeli security concerns and the complexity of urban warfare, Ronaldo interrupted him to ask why Palestinian children's security didn't seem to matter as much as Israeli security in the host's framing of the conflict, and why complexity was only invoked to justify certain types of violence, while other types of violence were presented as obviously unacceptable without requiring sophisticated analysis to condemn. "You keep talking about complexity," Ronaldo said, his voice growing stronger as he realized that this was not a good faith discussion but an attempt to discredit his humanitarian concerns. "But there is nothing complex about a child being killed in her bed by a missile. There is nothing sophisticated about a father carrying his dead son's body through rubble. There is nothing that requires expertise to understand that bombing schools and hospitals is wrong, regardless of who does it or what justification they offer for targeting places where civilians seek shelter and medical care." The host's response revealed the bias that had been barely concealed throughout the interview, as he suggested that Ronaldo was being naive about the realities of terrorism and self-defense, that his sympathy for Palestinian casualties was preventing him from understanding the legitimate security needs of a democratic nation surrounded by enemies who wanted to destroy it, and that his platform as an athlete gave him responsibilities to be balanced rather than one-sided in his commentary about conflicts where both sides had legitimate grievances that deserved equal consideration from public figures who claimed to care about peace and justice. Ronaldo's reaction to being lectured about balance and responsibility was immediate and devastating, his response cutting through the host's talking points with moral clarity that made everyone in the studio understand they were witnessing something unprecedented in mainstream media coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as he pointed out that demanding balance between occupier and occupied between military superpower and besieged population, between people with advanced weapons and people with no army or air force, was not journalism, but propaganda disguised as objectivity that treated systematic oppression as a both sides issue that required equal sympathy for unequal suffering. When you talk about balance, Ronaldo continued, looking directly into the camera rather than at the host, who had been trying to control the narrative, you are asking me to balance the deaths of thousands of Palestinian children against the political concerns of their killers. You are asking me to find middle ground between genocide and resistance to genocide. You are asking me to be diplomatic about war crimes because calling them war crimes might offend people who prefer their violence to be described in neutral language that makes mass killing sound like policy disagreements rather than moral catastrophes that demand clear condemnation from anyone who claims to value human life. The studio fell completely silent as Ronaldo's words hung in the air. Producers uncertain whether to cut to commercial or continue broadcasting what had become a devastating critique, not just of the host's approach, but of mainstream media coverage that treated Palestinian suffering as debatable rather than documented, that presented Israeli violence as defensive while presenting Palestinian resistance as terrorism, and that consistently applied different standards of evidence and moral judgment depending on which side was accused of violations that would be universally condemned if committed by less politically protected perpetrators. The host's attempt to regain control of the interview by suggesting that Ronaldo was anti-Semitic for criticizing Israeli policies backfired spectacularly when Ronaldo responded with the kind of moral clarity that exposed the intellectual dishonesty of conflating criticism of government actions with hatred of entire peoples, pointing out that opposing the killing of Palestinian children had nothing to do with anti-Semitism and everything to do with opposing the killing of children regardless of their ethnicity or religion, and that accusing critics of Israeli policies of anti-Semitism was a deliberate strategy to silence legitimate humanitarian concerns by weaponizing historical suffering to justify contemporary violence. I have Jewish friends, I have Muslim friends, I have Christian friends, Ronaldo said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who refused to be bullied into silence. And none of them think that their religion gives them the right to kill other people's children. None of them believe that their historical suffering justifies making other people suffer today. And none of them would want their identity to be used as cover for war crimes committed by governments that claim to represent them, while acting in ways that betray the moral teachings that are supposed to guide religious communities toward justice and compassion, rather than vengeance and domination. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, but the dynamic had fundamentally shifted, with the host reduced to reading prepared talking points, while Ronaldo responded with spontaneous moral arguments that revealed the emptiness of conventional media frameworks that treated obvious injustices as complex political issues requiring expert analysis rather than basic human decency, that any person with conscience could recognize and condemn without needing advanced degrees in international relations or Middle Eastern studies. The aftermath of the interview was immediate and intense, with clips circulating on social media within hours and generating millions of views from people who had never seen mainstream media challenged so directly and effectively by someone who refused to accept the premises and limitations that usually constrained celebrity discussions of political topics. And while some criticized Ronaldo for overstepping his role as an athlete, many more praised him for using his platform to speak truths that mainstream journalists seemed unable or unwilling to articulate clearly. The legal threats that followed came not from the television network, but from pro-Israel organizations that accused Ronaldo of spreading anti-Semitic propaganda and demanded retractions and apologies that he refused to provide, understanding that backing down would validate their strategy of using accusations of anti-Semitism to silence legitimate criticism of policies that violated international law and basic human rights, regardless of which government implemented them or which historical grievances were invoked to justify contemporary violence against civilian populations. The foundation that emerged from the controversy focused on supporting independent journalism that could report on conflicts without the political constraints that prevented mainstream media from covering Palestinian suffering with the same attention and sympathy that was automatically extended to Israeli suffering. And the Foundation's work helped amplify voices of Palestinian journalists, human rights workers, and ordinary people whose stories were systematically excluded from mainstream coverage that preferred to focus on political analysis rather than human impact of policies that affected millions of people whose lives were treated as less important than the political comfort of audiences who preferred not to confront the reality of violence committed in their names or with their support. Years later, when the interview had become a landmark moment in celebrity activism and media criticism, when mainstream coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict had begun to include more Palestinian perspectives, due partly to pressure generated by high-profile interventions like Ronaldo's, when the Foundation had helped establish independent media outlets that provided alternatives to corporate journalism that was constrained by advertising revenues and political relationships, Ronaldo would reflect that confronting the television host had been one of the most important moments of his career because it had demonstrated that celebrity platforms could be used to challenge media narratives that normalized injustice, rather than simply accepting the limitations that conventional wisdom placed on public discussions of topics that required moral clarity, rather than false balance between oppressor and oppressed, between powerful and powerless, between those who could speak freely and those whose voices were systematically silenced by people who preferred their violence to remain invisible and their victims to remain nameless.